feeling the chill of metal floors under my feet and the weight of 1,000 eyes from beings I could not even name staring at me, and I thought I had come here for answers, but instead I found silence that felt like a threat that pressed against my chest like gravity from a dead star. The holographic lights flickered above me, painting shadows across my face, and in that silence my comm unit buzzed and I froze, because I never expected it to ever buzz again. The transmission was faint at first, almost like a whisper from the void, and then the voice came through clear but not quite human. It had echoes of something familiar, something I should have recognized immediately, and yet the words cut through me sharper than a laser blade. Your husband is alive, but he is not human anymore. I dropped to my knees and the council erupted into murmurs that sounded like 1,000 alien tongues, but I heard nothing, except the cold echo of betrayal and my own heartbeat, pounding like the engines of a starship in hyperdrive. I remembered the day he disappeared, the day I thought grief would swallow me whole, when he vanished on a mission to the edge of the Orion expanse, leaving me behind with only memories of laughter and midnight stargazing and promises whispered between planets that we would see each other again. The council had told me it was impossible to recover him, that his pod had exploded, that nothing remained, and I had cried and screamed and prayed in the emptiness of my quarters, and now this voice was telling me everything I had believed was a lie. I staggered toward the central dais, the council members forming a circle that seemed to close around me like the rings of a dying planet, and I demanded who had sent the transmission, but the room went cold and empty, like space itself had swallowed their answers. And then one of them stepped forward, a being with eyes like liquid mercury and skin that shimmered with an internal light, and they said, the transmission is not a fabrication, it is a warning. And the warning itself made my stomach twist and my hands shake, and I could not speak for fear of betraying the torrent of emotion that threatened to tear me apart. The voice spoke again, cutting through the hum of the council. Your husband exists, but he is no longer human. He has become something else, a hybrid of flesh and machine, of consciousness and programming, of desires we cannot fathom. I sank to the floor, my knees pressed against the cold metal, and I could not think of anything except him, the man I loved, the warmth of his hands and the softness of his eyes. And how could this be? How could someone I knew and trusted and loved be transformed into something I could not recognize, something I might even fear? I demanded answers from the council, and they offered me only fragments, truths that stung like solar wind and lies that shimmered like distant galaxies. I learned that the mission he had been sent on had been compromised by a clandestine faction operating in the void between stars, a faction with technology beyond the comprehension of ordinary humans, and that his survival had involved integration into an alien consciousness. And now he was no longer bound by human morality, by human emotion, by human limits. I felt rage that burned hotter than a supernova and sorrow deeper than the black holes I had studied in my youth. I asked to see him, to confront the being that had once been my husband, and the council warned me it would change me forever, that looking into his eyes now would be like staring into the end of the universe. And I felt a pull I could not resist, a gravity I could not fight, and I agreed even as terror clawed at my chest and the room shifted around me as if reality itself was bending in preparation for what was coming. They transported me to a remote research station on the edge of the Vortex Nebula, a place I remembered from his old mission logs, a place filled with hums of energy and screens that flickered with alien code. And when I stepped into the chamber, there he was, or what remained of him, his body humanoid yet fractured, with metallic veins glowing beneath skin that shimmered like a prism, and eyes that were his but not his eyes, that contained memories I knew and secrets I did not. And the first word that came out of his mouth was mine, and it sounded like a prayer and a curse, and I fell to my knees because the sound of his voice was the only anchor left in the storm of my emotions. And then he spoke again. Your wife, you are here, you should not be here. And I reached for him, and his hand was warm yet not warm, the fingers felt like a living circuit, and he pulled back, and I realized that the person I loved and the entity before me were no longer the same, that the man who had kissed me under the twin moons of Kepler 9 was gone, replaced by something beyond comprehension, something that had seen the end of stars and had survived, and had forgotten what it meant to be human. I begged him to remember me, to remember who we were, to remember the love that had once spanned light years, and he hesitated, and his eyes flickered with recognition and then with something alien, and I realized the council was right, that this encounter would change everything, that nothing could not have come. I had to leave you behind to survive, and I felt my chest tighten because the words were true and false at the same time, because leaving me behind had been his choice and a manipulation, and I could see the truth in the way his body moved in ways no human body should move, and the subtle hum of energy beneath his skin that pulsed like a heartbeat that was not entirely his own. I asked him why he did not try to return, why he allowed me to grieve, and he hesitated, and for a moment I saw the man I had loved, the one who had whispered promises under starlight, and he said I could not, I was changed, I had to become something more to survive, something the council cannot understand. And I realized in that moment that survival had demanded betrayal, that love had been sacrificed for something beyond human comprehension, and my hands shook and my heart raced because the betrayal cut deeper than any laser could. The chamber walls flickered with projections of distant galaxies, and he moved toward one and touched it, and images filled the air: a ship burning in the void, a field of stars ripped apart, and a shadowy figure overseeing it all. And I understood then that he had been rewritten not by accident but by design, by a faction that sought to weaponize consciousness itself, and that I had been left in ignorance to protect them, to protect their secrets. And I felt fury rise like a tidal wave, because my grief had been stolen from me, because my life had been held hostage by a lie. I stepped closer to him and demanded answers about what he had become, what he truly was, and he looked at me with eyes that shimmered like nebulae and said, "I am both. I am him and not him. I am memory and machine. I am human and beyond human." And I realized that understanding him fully would mean losing myself, because his transformation had broken all rules of biology and morality, and I felt both awe and terror, because the person I had loved now carried the power to destroy worlds and the capacity to feel nothing at all. He reached for me and his fingers brushed mine, and the contact sent shocks of emotion that were foreign and familiar at once, and I gasped because I could feel pieces of him in me, pieces of memory intertwined with circuits and energy, and I realized that the hybrid could reach into my mind and touch my thoughts and memories, and in that moment I understood that he had not abandoned me entirely, that some part of him had waited for me. Across the void, across the transformation, across betrayal. Then the alarm sounded, a siren that split the chamber, and the council's warnings echoed in my mind: "You are not safe, you are a target, you have seen what should not be seen." And I turned to the screens and saw ships appearing on the edge of the nebula, their shapes unfamiliar and impossible, their weapons glowing with the intensity of dying suns, and I realized the faction that had changed him had tracked me down, and that my presence here was a threat that could ignite a war across galaxies, that I had become a pawn and the person I loved was now a weapon. I shouted at him to fight them, to protect me, to remember what we had shared, and he paused, and the light in his eyes flickered with something almost human, and then the chamber shook as the first energy blast hit, and I grabbed his arm and felt the pulse of power surge through me, and I understood that he was no longer limited by human ethics, that he could retaliate in ways that would annihilate our enemies and perhaps destroy innocence too. And I felt terror and hope and love all colliding in a singularity of emotion. He touched the central console, and his voice reverberated across the chamber: "I cannot let them take you, I cannot let them control me any longer." And I watched in disbelief as the hybrid that had once been my husband unleashed a wave of energy that distorted space itself, that sent the attacking fleet screaming into folds of reality where no human could follow. And I held him, and he looked at me with eyes that shimmered with memory and alien fire, and said, "I am still me, but I am not the man you loved." And I realized in that moment that survival had rewritten everything, that love could exist even across this impossible divide, but nothing would ever be simple again. Then the lights went out and a silence descended so complete it felt like the end of time itself, and I felt him close to me, and the hum of power beneath his skin calmed, and I whispered his name and he whispered mine, and for a moment the universe held its breath, and I knew that what had been lost could never be restored fully, but that we had survived, and that survival was the only proof of love that mattered in a cosmos that had betrayed us both. And then the transmission came again, faint at first, and I realized it was not from him, not from the council, but from someone watching, someone who had orchestrated everything, a shadow in the void. And I felt a cold shiver, because the mystery was not over, that the betrayal was deeper than I had imagined, that even the hybrid I had embraced could not protect me from all the truths that waited in the darkness. And I understood that the galaxy had plans for us both, that the story was far from finished, and that what I had learned about love, death, and transformation was only the beginning. I held him tighter as the first stars of a new day rose in the nebula, and I whispered to the hybrid who was my husband that no matter what he had become I would not let go, and he responded with a sound that was both human and alien, and the echoes of it spread across the chamber and beyond the nebula. And I realized that even in the void, even in betrayal, even in transformation, there were threads of connection, it was a message meant for both of us, a voice I recognized from the shadows of my past, a commander from the faction that had rewritten him, and the words were cold, calculated: "You have interfered with evolution, you have touched what should not be touched, and now you must be contained." And I felt a shiver run down my spine, because the threat was not just to me or to him, it was to every star system in reach of their technology. I looked at him and he seemed calm, yet the light beneath his skin pulsed with anticipation, and I realized that the man I loved and the machine he had become were preparing for war, and I knew in that moment that love and survival had become indistinguishable, that embracing him meant embracing chaos, that trusting him meant stepping into a storm that could consume everything I held dear. The chamber walls flickered with projections of worlds destroyed, fleets obliterated, civilizations erased, and I realized then that the faction's power was beyond comprehension, and that they had created him not just to survive but to enforce a vision of order that made gods look mortal. And I felt a mix of awe and horror, because the man I had loved had become both weapon and protector, both betrayer and savior, and the lines between human and alien had disappeared completely. He turned to me and whispered, "Your mind is the key. We can end this or we can join them." And I understood that my thoughts, memories and choices were now entwined with his consciousness, that even the smallest decision I made could trigger annihilation or salvation, and I felt the weight of the galaxy pressing on my shoulders, and yet I knew I could not look away, I could not refuse to act, because the bond that had survived transformation was stronger than fear, stronger than logic, stronger than anything the Council or the faction could have anticipated. I closed my eyes and reached into the shared consciousness and saw flashes of his transformation, the labs hidden beyond nebulae, the experiments that had rewritten neurons and DNA, the melding of thought and energy that had stripped away humanity and rebuilt it into something new. And I felt tears streaming down my face, because the man I had loved had been broken and remade, and yet somehow a part of him had waited for me across the void, across betrayal, across impossible distance. We acted as one, and the first strike came not from the hybrid nor from me, but from the faction's own systems collapsing under their hubris, under the very technology they had used to manipulate life itself. And I realized then that the hybrid had become more than human, not just stronger, faster, more intelligent, but clever enough to turn enemies into their own undoing. And I watched the transmission fade as one by one their commands faltered, their fleets dissolved, their control unraveled, and I felt relief and terror and awe all at once, because the victory was total but the cost unknowable. He turned to me, fully human in expression though alien in being, and said, "I remember everything I lost, everything I became, everything I wanted to protect." And I realized then that he was telling the truth, that some part of him had survived the rewriting intact, and that love had endured even across circuits and code, across betrayal and terror, across the vast cold spaces between stars. And I felt my heart surge, because in a universe of incomprehensible forces, of betrayal and death, of transformation, something as fragile as love had survived. But then the chamber shook again, and I realized it was not over. The shadows moved, the faction was not destroyed entirely. There were forces still in the dark, still watching, still planning, and I knew then that the galaxy would never be safe, that our story would continue in ways I could not imagine. And yet I felt hope, because the man I loved, the hybrid I embraced, would not let the darkness win, not while we stood together. And I understood that the true battle was not against fleets or factions, but against the impossible choices the universe demanded, and we would face them side by side. I held him and whispered that no matter what he had become, no matter the horrors he had seen, no matter the stars that might fall between us, I would not let go. And he held me tighter and said, "Neither will I." And I realized then that survival had rewritten everything, but had also forged something unbreakable, a bond beyond human comprehension, beyond betrayal, beyond fear. And as the first light of distant suns filtered through the nebula, I knew that though the galaxy was vast and dark and full of secrets, we had found a place in it together, a place where love could survive even in the coldest reaches of space, even in the shadow of transformation. And then the final message came, not through transmission but through thought, a whisper across consciousness, "You are the future." The hybrid smiled, and I felt the weight lift, and I understood that the universe had chosen us not because we were perfect, but because we were willing to endure, to hold on to each other, to survive. And I knew that our story was far from over, but for the first time in centuries I felt something I had thought lost, hope. And I held him as the stars shifted around us, and I whispered, "We will face it all together." And he whispered back, "Always." And the galaxy seemed to wait with bated breath as we stepped into the unknown together, the impossible, and yet somehow we survived.